Hello and welcome to all our Chestertonians watching us all over the world. My name is Ivo Džeba. I'm Vice President of Croatian Chestertonian Club, and I will be host of the second part of our Chester Shock online conference. Today, we have not just one, but two very special guests with us, all the way from America, Mr. Josephom Pearce and Mr. Joeom Grabowski. I will say just a few words about each of them, because you are not here to listen to me. You are here to listen to them. So Josephom Pearce is a well-known writer, and I think there is no significant Christian writer from 20th century about whom Joseph didn't write at least an essay, if not a whole book. So we have one of his books translated in Croatian, and it's Josephom Pearce's book about Josephom Pearce. And it's called Race with the Devil. In Croatian, it's translated as Moja utrka s đavlom. But it has very little to do with the devil. It's not the book about exorcism. It's a book about his journey home, journey to Catholic faith. I read it twice, and I would highly recommend it to anyone else to read it. It's published by Verbum, so you can find it there. Our second guest is Joeom Grabowski. Joe is executive director in International Organizations for the Family. He describes himself as an activist, scholar, enthusiast, and educator. Haven't read any of his books, but I listened to his lecture on today's topic, which is distributism. And it was very insightful, so listen carefully to what he has to say today. Short notice to all listeners, you can write down your question in YouTube comments, and I will read them to our guests after their 20-minute lectures. Also, I use this opportunity to thank our Benedictine friends from Nursia, who are producing this wonderful beer I have here. I see that Joseph tried the beer.
Very good. It's very good. Mm-hmm.
He likes it. So
oh, yeah.
Still, I'm not sure if you can buy it in Croatia still, but we hope one day we will also have it in Croatian. So we agree that the first lecture will be that of Mr. Grabowski. So Mr. Grabowski, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ivo, and hello again, Joseph. Hello, everyone watching. I'm going to present some, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm going to present some slides, so bear with me one moment while I share my screen. Okay. So today I want to talk about distributism in kind of a philosophical perspective and talk about two orders of analysis that I think distributism differs in from the dominant modern paradigm of capitalism or semi-capitalism, which I think is more accurately the description of the way that the economy is run in most Western countries today, which is sort of capitalism with a heavy hand of management by the state. And certainly along these two avenues of analysis, distributism differs from socialism. And those avenues are axiology and axiology. And I'll explain what those are as we move forward. So first, axiology. Axiology has to do with what we value as a culture, how we assign values to ordered lists. You know, something is either of great value or of little value, depending on our axiology. There's a lot of words that fly around in economic circles that touch upon this area of philosophy or axiology. Worth, value, wealth, cost, utility. These are the words that economists, and particularly capitalist economists, will use to discuss the economy. But I would argue that the definitions of each of these terms is somewhat impoverished in capitalist terminology because of the fact that they try to treat their analysis as a hard science, as a science like physics or a science even like mathematics. And in actuality, when you're dealing with human motivation and human actors, you have to take philosophy, you have to take anthropology, and I would argue you have to take religion into account. And if you take those things into account, you're going to have much different definitions, much different ideas about what constitutes worth, what constitutes value, about where wealth should be kept, and what priority it should have in our lives, of what the analysis of a cost of something really is, and finally, what utility something has, and whether or not it's a mere temporary utility that it has for us or something more permanent. So the questions that you will have in the discourse, whether it's capitalists or distributists talking about it, for example, are how much does this cost when we take something off the shelf? And according to capitalism, the way that we determine that is simply by looking at the price tag. That also describes for us what it is worth, and worth in capitalist analysis has to do with the value that that object has for us, the utility that that object has for us, and they have all kinds of laws that describe the way these things work, such as the law of diminishing marginal utility. But when distributists look at these things, they ask the questions much more thoroughly than do our capitalist counterparts. The price function that the capitalists use that reflects what that thing costs on the price tag is a useful tool. It does give us some information about that thing, but some of that information is information we might not like. If anyone has listened to my series of podcasts that I did for the American Chesterton Society, or now the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, you might have heard me in one of those episodes tell a story about an apple that someone goes to the store and picks off the shelf and tries to buy just that one single apple, and they get told that the apple is worth, 79 cents. And that boggles the mind when you consider the fact that the apple had to be picked from a tree and placed on a truck and driven to the store and handled by a stock boy and washed by some kind of handler and then put out on the shelves and then tagged for pricing. 79 cents doesn't seem to capture a lot of those costs. And capitalist economists, to be fair, they do have ways of accounting for some of these things. These are terms that they use, such as externalized costs, marginal utility, perceived obsolescence. But here again, distributists, when asking questions about these things, ask them in a very different, and I would argue, deeper way. When we say, how much does this thing cost? We're not just thinking of the price that we have to pay to achieve that thing, but also what was the cost in producing that thing? Did this thing involve a child in the Congo going down into a mine to get coltan out of the earth, which is a substance that's in almost all of our electronic devices, especially cell phones? Perceived obsolescence is when we're made to feel by the lure of advertising, perceived demand. The supply creates the demand. We're told the new iPhone is out, and everybody feels like the current iPhone that's in their hand, which is perfectly in working order, provided that Apple's not slowing it down or causing its battery to die faster, which they've been accused of doing in the past. The item we have might be perfectly worthwhile, but suddenly we feel that it's obsolete, that we need the brand new thing. Distributism checks at that question and asks us to reconsider whether or not we're really counting the cost, whether or not we're really valuing the things that we have and the things that we acquire. And finally, I would argue that distributists focus much more than either socialists or capitalists on the most important question, the fundamental question that every child has mastered, the question of why. I recall one time it was one of my nieces or nephews. I can't remember whether it was my brother's child or my sister's child, but it was raining outside and they said that they wanted to go outside and play. And obviously the parents said, no, it's raining outside, answering the question of why they couldn't go outside and play. But then the child follows up with a question, why? Why is it raining? And that's a question that we don't ask as adults. But in a way, if we adopt that sense of Chestertonian wonder into our lives, and I argue that all distributists should do that, maybe we want to ask that question, why? Why is something the way that it is? Why are things of the value that we assign them? And why ultimately do we carry about in this economic way of life? Why are we engaging in trade and in production and in consumption? Distributists are very preoccupied with that question. which makes distributism really, if you had to define it as a category of science, I would argue that it's a subset of ethics, especially of Christian ethics. It is not claiming to be one of the hard sciences like chemistry or physics or mathematics, but rather it is something that deals with the whole of the human person. And that has to do with that question, why? And the question why leads us into the next topic of aetiology. And aetiology is simply the study of causes. It's a word that some of us might have heard rolling around even in the news as of late, because the experts on infectious disease, talk about the aetiology of a virus, the disease-causing agent. And if you're familiar with classical philosophy, you might zone out here for a little bit, but allow me quickly to just review some of the terms that we get from Aristotle about the four causes. So the first of the four causes is the formal cause. And this is one of the ways that helps us answer the question, the all-important question of why, but also all the other questions that we might ask about things economic: who, what, where, when, how. And the formal cause is the plan, the idea, the inspiration for a thing. In the classic example used in every philosophy textbook for a freshman in college, you have Michael carving the sculpture of, Michelangelo carving the sculpture of David. And the plan, the idea in Michelangelo's mind is the formal cause that brings the statue about, the procedure he's going to follow as he plans and thinks about this work of art that he's going to create. You could also argue in a way that the formal cause is the figure of David himself, at least as he looms in Michelangelo's imagination. And distributists would point to the economy in terms of the formal cause and ask the question whether or not workers in the broad economy, whether most workers even associate to the formal cause of things. Does the factory worker simply stamping out a part for a car on an assembly line and creating thousands of widgets every day, does he have any formal cause for what he's doing? Is he attached to his work in that way by means of the formal cause? Certainly he's not in the way that a craftsman like Michelangelo is in creating the statue of David, or a carpenter is in creating a chair or a table that you might use in your dining room. And distributists prize that kind of association between the work being done and the worker himself. And I'm quoting here a term that Marx made popular, but I think that distributists and Catholic social teaching can adopt without being abashed: the alienation of the worker. Of course, Marx meant the alienation of the worker from the means of production, from the tools and the capital. And the distributists, like Belloc, also talked about that kind of alienation of the worker. But there's a more serious kind of alienation of workers in our modern economy. And that has to do with this alienation from the form of the thing that they're creating, from not really having any invested interest in what it is that they're doing. The second of the four causes I'd point to is the material cause. And this has to do, in economic terms, with ecology, our health, our supply chain. The material cause in the example of the statue is the marble out of which Michelangelo is going to carve David. But when we deal with things economic, this could be anything. This could be the food that we eat, the things that we're taking into our body, whether it's packed with antibiotics and preservatives and chemicals, pesticides that we spray on our crops. How do we produce our food? What are the material cause elements that go into that? The coltan in our cell phones, where does that come from? What do we know about the ecology of those things? Speaking also in terms of human ecology, is it a good thing that things are manufactured in sweatshops by children? Some even Catholic capitalist apologists, I just read a book recently actually called Can a Catholic Be a Socialist from Catholic Answers Press. On the whole, a very good book, but one of the arguments that they repeat that I found troubling is that when children went into sweatshops in Bangladesh to work, the objection was, well, it's not a great thing that they're working in sweatshops, but if they weren't working in sweatshops, they'd be doing something even worse. They'd be out on the streets running drugs or perhaps forced into prostitution. And yeah, if you evaluate it that way, you might say that their lot is better, that they're working in the sweatshop. However, distributists would probe that question a little further and say, why can't we have an alternative to both? Why not reject both the prostitution and the drug running on the streets and also the sweatshops? So the material cause has to do with asking the questions, very important in our lives of consumption. Where do things come from and where do they go? And then I'll speak briefly about the efficient cause. The efficient cause is kind of a complicated cause because it has two parts to it. First is the agent. The agent is Michelangelo in our former example, the guy carving the statue. This is the efficient cause per se. This is the individual craftsman, the artist about his work. And we can really ask whether or not any workers in our modern economy fulfill this model, have the full agency in their work, or whether or not they aren't reduced to material causes themselves, whether labor isn't treated like just another piece of the assembly line. Does the worker have full agency? And then there's the action, the instrumental cause, which ties in elements of formal and material causality. The action, the techne, the skill that is used in creating a thing is part of the efficient causality of that thing. And here, once again, we would wonder whether or not a lot of the jobs that people fulfill in their day-to-day lives are fulfilling this important causality. John Paul II in Centesimus Annus, the great encyclical on the economy, spoke about how in the modern economy, the primary sources of wealth were no longer land or even material capital, but the human person himself and the imagination and the creativity of the human person. And that's certainly true if you look at the ledger sheet and you look at the products that come, say, out of Silicon Valley that aren't goods and services that we consume directly or put into our bodies. They're not that material stuff. We do have an economy of ideas to a large extent. But who participates in that economy of ideas? Who are the free agents in that economy? Who has opportunity of entry to that economy? It's not the low-paid workers on the factory assembly line, and the chance of them bettering their lives and getting into that ideas economy, even though it's lauded by people, especially like here in America, the American dream, they have that possibility of an upward trajectory. But how realistic is that? That's a question that troubles distributists. And finally, in terms of axiology, I'll talk about the final cause. This is the most important cause, answering that question of why, the question that distributists, I would say, are obsessed with. This answers the question why in its immediate and ultimate sense. What is a thing for, but also what is man for? And why are we doing the work that we're doing? The Baltimore Catechism provides an answer to this question. For the Croatians among our audience, you might not be familiar with this, but this is we called it the Penny Catechism here in America. And even as late as I was growing up in the 1980s, this was used by the nuns in my grade school to teach us some of our lessons. And the very first question of the Catechism is, who made me? The answer is, God made me. And then the second question is, why did God make me? And the answer that the Catechism gives is to know, love, and serve him in this life and to be happy with him forever in the next. That's ultimately the answer to the question of why. And distributists would argue that our economic activity is all part of that journey of pleasing God, of serving God, loving God, and hopefully getting us to heaven so that we can remain with God forever in eternity. And the question of why and the final cause leads us to probe the question of what is the economy for? Is the economy made as something that serves man, or is the economy an absolute that man is summoned to serve? I would argue that distributism alone of the three paradigms of economics that are out there, capitalism, socialism, and distributism alone really centers man as the end of economic activity. Man's welfare, man's eternal welfare, man's happiness, and a really fulfilled life. That's what distributists seek. And I would argue that's also what God wants for us. I'll end finally with this psalm that I think relates to some of what I was talking about before I hand it over to Joseph and Ivo. Psalm 127 in the modern numbering, depending on your edition of the Bible, it might be Psalm 126. But it reads, "If the Lord does not build the house, in vain do its builders labor. If the Lord does not guard the city, in vain does the guard keep watch. In vain is your earlier rising, your going later to rest, you who toil for the bread you eat, when he pours gifts on his beloved while they slumber. Truly, children are a gift from the Lord, a blessing, the fruit of the womb. Indeed, the sons of youth are like arrows in the hand of a warrior. Blessed is the warrior who has filled his quiver with such arrows. He will have no cause for shame when he disputes with his foes in the gateways." The question of why do we engage in this economic activity? What is the economy for? It is primarily for leaving something to the next generation. Distributists are ardently, in that way, pro-life. We're very much concerned with making sure that we leave the earth better than we found it for the next generation, that we leave whatever wealth we are able to gain, that we put it at the disposal of others, primarily our own children and our offspring, but also of the community at large, that we make the world a better place through our economic endeavors. And I would argue that that is the vision that Chesterton and Belloc have offered to us in their distributist writings. That's the vision that Joseph offers to us in his distributist writings. And that's the vision I look forward to talking to you about in the Q&A later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I think it was very, very nicely put in your 20-minute talk, and like that many listeners who even maybe are not familiar with distributism got good main idea what is it all about. So now, Joseph, you have your 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I would like to begin actually. Well, there are two things I'd like to begin with. First of all, to say hello to all of my friends that I've not yet seen in Croatia. I'm feeling somewhat frustrated because, as some of you may know, I was supposed to be at the Croatian Chesterton conference last year, and because of 2 of my flights in a row being cancelled for mechanical reasons by United Airlines, I didn't get there, and I did give a talk at last year's conference actually in this manner via the internet. And both Joe and I were supposed to be in Croatia today, in fact, probably enjoying a Norse beer with our Croatian friends together. But instead, and unfortunately, we find ourselves in virtual reality and not incarnate reality. But that's fine. We'll make do with it. And then the second thing I want to say is to thank Joe for that absolutely marvelous, excellent, succinct, and eloquent talk, which certainly lays the philosophical foundations for distributism, which is not what I'm proposing to do, not least because I would not do it as well. So we've got a bit of dovetailing here. Because basically things down maybe level, but I'm going to begin some first principles. In that, at least, I will be similar to Joe, although my first principles are primarily theological, not philosophical. Because I would say, first of all, the first principle of all is that all is subject to God. So we'll be talking, as we talk about distributism, in terms of the 2, if you like, tensions, maybe a bit like a cross, if you like, the foundation of Catholic social teaching, of which distributism is an expression, solidarity and subsidiarity. A large part of my talk here. But the first axiomatic principle of subsidiarity is that we do not have an absolute right to do our own thing, politically, economically, or anything else, because all is subject to God. If we are doing things politically and economically which are immoral, unethical, that is illicit terms of economic or political practice, moral practice. In other words, politics and economics are subject to morality, which is subject to the commandments of God. First principle, all is subject to God. The second principle is all is subject to God's commandments. And I would argue that basically we must love the Lord our God. The great command that gives us is we must love our neighbor. So
sorry, Joseph, can you hear? We lost several of your sentences because I think there's something with connection. So
okay, what do you want me to do? Back up?
Now it's better, but it's like every 20 seconds or something we lose sentence or two. So
okay, so where do you want me to continue?
Connection.
Hello?
Oh yes, I can hear you very well.
I can't see you now, by the way. I've just
I just turned off our videos probably to help that your connection be better. So yeah, now it's better. I think you can continue now.
Okay, well, I'm going to basically give the 20-second version of the thing I just spent 2 minutes on to say that basically it's subject of God. The first principle is any policy, economics, which is moral, and contrary to the commandments of God is illicit. And then the second principle is all subject to God's commandments, and the two great commandments that our Lord gives us, to love the Lord our God and to love our neighbor. And I would argue that these are the pillars of those two commandments, which have social teaching, distributivism is an expression of founding. And that's normally in social terms of subsidiarity and solidarity. So I'm going to begin first with solidarity and the relationship between solidarity and the common good. In other words, that solidarity is rooted in the fact that we have a moral responsibility to love our neighbor. So doing something, being motivated economically and politically by purely selfishness, putting ourselves first, lead to an economic and political system which does not love our neighbor, but in fact leaves our neighbor vulnerable and leaves our neighbor exploited, makes our neighbor an enemy instead of a friend. So solidarity in relation to common good has to be our understanding of politics and economics. Now, subsidiarity and its relationship to the common good is loving our neighbor's family. So this is important here because it's not about individualism. It's not about the individual. The basic healthy unit of all human society is a healthy human family. The love that you have between parents and children, and in the extended sense between brothers, sisters, cousins, the extended family is the cement that holds a healthy culture, politically, economically, culturally together. If that family is eroded, everything else will crumble. So at the roots of our understanding of economics and politics is not the individual and individual liberty, but the freedom and health of the family. So in order to show solidarity to our neighbors, we have to show solidarity to our neighbor's family. And that means ultimately, whether we're married or not, we have to put our self-interest second to the interest of a healthy family. That is the very foundation of a distributive understanding of the economy and of politics is rooted on that. And I'm going to give a few axioms or maxims now by some well-known people. I think it captures our understanding of what is a healthy economics and politics in a distributive sense. The first two might be called conservative, and the third might be called liberal. And I've deliberately I've put in these in quotation marks because these terms are very messy. But the important thing, the reason I'm putting both, is that distributism transcends and supersedes what so against solidarity is Edmund Burke's famous maxim that liberty itself must be limited in order to be possessed. In other words, there's no such thing as an absolute freedom to do what we like. If we try to do that, we will basically destroy our neighbor, destroy our culture, and also destroy ourselves. So it's not even a win-lose, it's a lose-lose-lose situation. And the best way of dovetailing that is the words of Oscar Wilde, who in one of his poems defined anarchy as freedom's own Judas. Anarchy is freedom's own Judas. In other words, it's the kiss of the traitor to freedom, because with anarchy, freedom is destroyed. In other words, when you have no law, what happens is not everybody's free and happy and gets back to the garden. What happens when you have no law is the most powerful and the most ruthless and the most wicked take over. So no law leads to tyranny. So freedom, anarchy is freedom's own Judas. And then the third, which if you like, is axiomatic to our understanding of subsidiarity, is Lord Acton's famous saying that power tends to corrupt and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. In other words, that the more power that individuals have, the more corrupt they're likely to be. And as Chesterton says, the sort of people that want power are not really the sort of people who want to have it. So one of the tendencies in economics and politics is for those with power to actually centralize more power for themselves. So big government has a tendency to always get bigger. Big business has a tendency to always get bigger. And of course, the consequence of that is that the smaller people, whether it's an individual or a family or a small business or a small nation or a county or a state within a bigger nation, are left actually powerless because of this process. So as I've said already, we have to always think in terms of the family versus the individual. If there is a conflict between individual rights and the rights of the family supersedes the rights of the individual. Without that understanding, everything comes tumbling and crumbling down. I would then say that the heart of distributism, if we understand the family as being at the center and being foundational and at the heart, in every sense of the word, of a healthy society, then distributism is about home management. And again, going back to basics, we need to remember that the word economics from the Greek actually comes from home management, managing the household. So let's get back to those fundamental understandings of economics, that really it begins at the level of the home, at the level of the family, and economics as if families mattered is distributism. All of the niceties of economic law, econometrics, which Joe referred to in his talk, must all be subsistent to the management of the home, to the health of the family. And then from home management, we also get home security, that the home has to be secure. Now, in political and economic terms, that means that private property, the property of the family, is sacrosanct, that a family needs to, well, it's going to be much healthier as a family and more economically and politically free if the family owns the land on which it lives, the place in which it works, the tools with which it works. So this sort of home security means we need to have private property, including economic productive property, distributed widely, not by a big government doing the redistribution of wealth, which is what certain people accuse distributism of, but basically by policies that encourage more people to own productive private property. In other words, an economy that's made up of small businesses, and many small businesses, not a few big businesses. An economy where small businesses are the norm or the defining character is a healthy economy. An economy where the macro business and in our day and age, the global corporation is the norm and the small business is the exception, and the powerless exception is an abnormality from the point of view of subjecting economics to morality. So private property is the guarantor of freedom. By the way, it's also in terms of politics that we have to understand that subsidiarity means decentralized politics. It's not just that modern capitalist economics leads to bigger and bigger global corporations and more people working for those global corporations in terms of alienated workers. It's also in terms that the governments get bigger and bigger and bigger and become unions and empires, such as the European Union. And to very quickly give an example of the history of the European Union as an example of what might be called the law of progressive centralization in politics, unless it's countered by decentralization. The European Union began actually as a group of 3 countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, known collectively as Benelux. And these little 3 small countries thought if they got together and had a free trade agreement, it would allow them to be competitive with the big countries surrounding them. So the UK, France, Germany. Fair enough, I have no argument with that. And then the big countries joined, right? So then the thing changed altogether. Germany and France, what was the 6th? It wasn't the UK, we joined later. But the first 6, but that was known as the common market. Again, it's just a common market. It's a free trade zone. What's the problem? And when there was a referendum for the UK to join the common market back in the early 70s, people warned that this is an embryonic United States of Europe. And they were told that they were merely being alarmist, and that's nonsense. It's just a common market. So the British people vote to join a common market. There's no other vote after that as regards the referendum. But what happens? The common market starts to call itself the European Economic Community. So it's no longer a common market, it's an economic community. They then drop the word economic, and it's then the European Community. So it's now not just economics, it's politics and culture and the rest of it. And then they drop the word community and change it to union, European Union. This is an example of the progressive centralization of political power that needs to be countered with decentralization back to small nation states, national sovereignty, and within the United States, power becoming devolved away from the federal government back to state government and local government. So here we see how the notion of subsidiarity, decentralization of power back in the direction of the family, works on an economic and a political level. Just want to say 2 more things. In the old days, the argument between, we might say in the Cold War, if you like, the argument was you had to make a choice between communism or socialism on the one hand and capitalism on the other. You had to be one or the other. You had to choose your sides, and there were only 2 sides to choose from. And in general terms, the choice was between basically having the economy run by big business or having the economy run by big government. So you had to make the choice, if you like, between 2 evils. Now, do you prefer big government or do you prefer big business? Because you're going to be ruled by one or the other. But what we've seen as things actually evolve is that big government and big business are in bed with each other. Big government likes big business. It deals with it better. They're on that same large centralized level. Big business loves big government. In fact, big business doesn't like government at all. So you have one big government they've got to deal with, which they will probably control. Game over. So the whole idea of eroding national sovereignty, globalism as an ideology where all national barriers to the free movement of labor and capital are removed. That's where we're at now with globalism and globalization. Big government and big business hand in hand. So it's a false choice now to talk about the choice between capitalism or socialism, because capitalism and socialism are in bed together. The alternative is an economics and a politics based upon the human person and his relationship with God and with his neighbor, and the human family as the foundation of all healthy human society. And how do we arrange our politics and our economics to bring that about and to counter the progressive centralization we see? And I'm just going to finish on a practical level. And, you know, in many ways, what Joe and I have done is the way it has to be done. You give the principles, and once people understand the principles, they can work out how to put the principles into practice. Because sometimes the practice is going to change. The practical application of a principle will vary. So in terms of history, you know, the way that you would apply distributist principles 150 years ago are going to be different to the way you apply them today. And similarly, the way that we might use the laws of the United States and the economy of the United States to help bring about a distributist, things moving in a distributist direction will be different from what you'll be doing in Croatia, other parts of the world. So it's important to get the principles right, and then we could talk about how those principles are applied at grassroots level on the ground where we happen to be in time and space. I would say one thing, however, as a general principle that's applicable in a practical sense everywhere at all times. And that's that we can change the world with our daily bread. By which I mean that the most powerful votes that we have are not the votes that we give in the elections. They're important. I'm certainly not suggesting people should not vote in the elections. But, you know, elections come around and sometimes you get a good choice and sometimes you get a choice between Tweedledee and Tweedledum, or Tweedledee and Tweedledummer. But you can actually vote every single day of your life with every dollar or every euro or whatever currency we're talking about you spend. So we change the world on a daily basis because every penny we spend is a moral act. And if we can actually, first of all, understand this ourselves and practice it ourselves, and then get other people to understand and practice it, we will change the world for the better. Because every dollar you spend, every penny you spend is either making the world a better place or a worse place. So we are either part of the solution or part of the problem every time we open our wallets and spend a penny. So bearing that in mind, and that principle, we can go from this meeting having talked about the principles and make a practical difference where we are at the moment to the world that we live to make it a better place. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph. I was reading questions which came, and I will read them in a moment. But just like 30-second commercial break. In our YouTube description, we have a link to our kind of web shop, and we have our Chestertonian t-shirts. It says, "Humility is the mother of giants." I'm not sure if it's correct, completely correct translational quote, but it's the idea. And the second black t-shirt we also have. It says, "Fallacy don't cease to be fallacies when they become fancies." So we have those t-shirts, and we have also from today badges. So you can buy yourself this little badge, and then you can know immediately on the street who is your guy, who is distributist, who is Chestertonian, and like it's very good for making new friends. And I have also Chestertonian tie with many quotes. You can also buy those at Croata shops. So thank you for very insightful and really inspiring talks, both of you. I think none of our listeners are capitalists anymore or socialists, if there were any socialists. So I think they're all distributists now. But before they became distributists, they asked some questions. And I will read some of them. Some of them you maybe already answered during your talk. But yeah, you can say your thoughts on that. So one of the question is, what is the role of the state in a distributist economy? And it's like, I will I will put two questions in one. If distributism is something like which is natural to man, then maybe we don't need any support of the state to put distributism in practice. So it's like idea, just let the people alone and they will make distributive society. Do you agree with that, or what do you think would be a role of the state?
Perhaps we'll establish a modus operandi here where I'm going to defer to my much better looking friend to go first, and I'll go second.
Okay.
Sure. So in response to the first question, I would say that distributism is, while informed by Catholic social teaching and certainly growing out of Catholic social teaching, and based upon principles of truth that are reflected in Christian anthropology and morality, it can stand on its own and be presented to a secular world as an argument based on its own principles and the common philosophical principles born out of the natural law that we share with other people. And that's an important point in order to evangelize with distributism or evangelize for distributism, to spread this message. So I don't think that we have to present it as so bound up with the faith that we're essentially telling people you have to convert and be baptized in order to espouse distributism. As to the second question, this is something I differ somewhat with some of the other people that speak on this subject, but I'll just offer my opinion. Oftentimes I get asked, how can we put distributism into practice in our daily lives? And kind of tongue-in-cheek, my answer is you can't. Now, of course, Joseph described for us how we can, with our wallets, go out and show support for the local businesses, for the small businesses, etc. But what I mean by that is that distributism is a social schema. It is a social philosophy. You can adopt in your own personal life the way some of the ideas coming out of distributism, but you can't ensure a widespread distribution of productive property by yourself in your day-to-day life. We need to use the mechanisms of community, which I think democracy make possible. But there are even other social schemes you could potentially see a spreading of distributism. But yes, it's natural to us in a certain respect. That is true, but it's natural to us in the way that, say, monogamy is natural to us. That is to say, the enemy, the devil, along with the temptations coming from the world and the flesh, are constantly trying to draw us away from that ideal. And so distributism is natural as an ideal, but we as fallen men don't naturally follow that ideal. And so we need supernatural grace, but we also need to organize together and spur one another on to follow it.
Okay, if I can add to that, the first thing I would say about, because one of the arguments that's often used by advocates of capitalism, particularly free market, libertarian version of capitalism, against distributism, is we must be socialist because we believe that the government needs to be involved in the economy. Well, the first thing I want to say there is that there's no such thing as a free market. There never has been and never can be. Go right back to the medieval markets. Those with economic power used it. And so the market's always being manipulated by those with economic power for their own self-interest. So there's no such thing as a free market. And then the other thing about, can't we just be left alone to do our own thing? And if we do our own thing, then distributism will happen naturally. We don't need a government at all. The first thing I would argue is that's the sort of the philosophical error of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the idea that we are noble savages, and if we were just left alone, we wouldn't need any laws because we'd all be nice to each other. Well, that, of course, denies the existence of original sin, which means that there's a large part of what we are, which is tempted by selfishness and pride and the devil, and which comes back to the quote I gave about Oscar Wilde, that anarchy, the absence of any government, anarchy is freedom's own Judas. So yes, we do need government, and no, there's not any such thing as a free market. to be protected. It doesn't exist. So as regards whether the government should be involved in the economy, I'm going to give one practical example. I think my best way of answering, and it's from the UK. So from England. In the early 1970s, most of the pubs in England, I'm on our favorite subject now, you know this, yes, our pubs. But most of the pubs in England were actually owned by a handful, just 4 major breweries. And the quality of their beer was awful, but they had a guaranteed market because they owned the pubs. And the landlords of the pubs were tenants, and they had to sell the product of that particular macro-sized brewery. In consequence, the consumer was not getting good ale. It was impossible to get good ale because all of the ale produced by these big brewers was bad. So here we have an example, not of government interference, but of big business interference in the market to guarantee that the products that we are buying are the only products we can buy because the producer owns the supply chain. So what happened? Well, first of all, a group of people got together and formed the Campaign for Real Ale. It began with 4 men in a pub in Dublin, decided to found the Campaign for Real Ale. Within about 7 or 8 years, they had 30,000 members. This now became a force. Now, one thing that happened is these people practicing distributist principles started their own small breweries, their own craft breweries. The problem was they couldn't sell their products because all the pubs, or the vast majority of the pubs, were owned by the big 4 brewers. So then this group that began as a distributist lobby group began to lobby Parliament. And they got the law changed. So government was involved. They got the law changed so that every pub in the country, regardless of who owned it, needed to have a guest ale, which would actually be a product other than the main product supplier. This gave the small brewers access to the market. Then the supply and demand curve kicked in once the market was liberated by government intervention. And then all of a sudden we have hundreds of small breweries. That's a perfect example of that government can be necessary. Big government is bad. We've got to try to get back to revitalized local government and decentralized central government. That's a different issue.
Thank you so much. We were twice in England as a club, last year and 2 years before, and I can only say that we are very thankful for this initiative for a real ale. Yes, and I will read also some other questions. One questioner asked, what would our guests say about Spanish Mondragon Corporation and its economical practice? It is definitely an international corporation, but on the other side, it's self-managed by workers. So do you know anything more about this Mondragon Corporation? I've heard about it, and it works.
Joe, do you want to speak to that first?
Sure, yeah. Mondragon is often sought after as proof positive that distributism can work in a modern industrial manufacturing context. They are huge manufacturers. They make a lot of different kinds of wares and excuse me, certainly operate on an economy of scale, even though it is worker owned and operated. And so the idea of worker owned collectives or worker owned cooperatives is certainly one of the tools that distributists would advocate for in order to gain economic power back and redistribute that economic power and productive property.
Yeah, wonderful. I would agree with that. I wrote a book called Small is Still Beautiful, Economics as if Families Mattered. And there are a couple of chapters in that about cooperatives. One's called Cooperate and Prosper. And there's a section in that on the Mondragon experiment. And it does show, and it basically that for what it's worth, the whole Mondragon experiment was founded by a Catholic priest who was inspired by Catholic social teaching. It's taken off. It's not perfect. Of course, you can find people to find things wrong with it, but that's because it's human. But as Joe said, that it does show that distributist principles, the principles of widely distributed property, can work in large-scale corporations as producers, cooperatives.
Thank you. So another question is, world was much different when Chesterton and Belloc were alive. It was much more people lived on the countryside, and many of, let's say, main principle of distributism are also connected with like country life. So how can we today, especially we who live in like big cities, 1 million people or more, implement distributism in our lives, in our cities, maybe in our laws also? How to put it in practice in bigger cities? It's like a lot harder to have a production means in your hand if you live in a city. If you live in a countryside, like you have a field and you have your means of production, but in the city, how to make it?
Joe, do you want to go first?
Yeah, and for a change, I'll be very practical rather than theoretical. I don't know how things work in Croatia, but here in America, for example, in many municipalities, townships and cities, when a business permit application comes in, say from a large chain like Walmart or McDonald's, there's a public advisory period where concerned citizens can actually write to the town council or things like that and protest against those kinds of concerns coming into their neighborhood. In short, we can engage in small ways, the way that Joseph described, patronizing the local businesses that are there. In terms of our own economic work, we could request. I think that the coronavirus crisis has proved that the modern office space is in many ways a fictive benefit. It's not real. Most people are working fine from home. Modern technology has enabled a lot of these things. Modern technology has enabled people to easily create their own web store and sell some of the things that they can craft in their own house, whether it be candles or small articles of clothing or things like that. So to use the opportunities that technology affords us to try to work from home and then have a hobby interest on the side that we can maybe turn into a productive enterprise, to take concern about what kinds of businesses are thriving in our own backyard, see what we can do about thwarting the big businesses and propping up the small businesses. Those are some of the things that we can do without fleeing to the fields and returning to the land. But on that last point, I just want to say one more thing. I have always consistently maintained that the idea of agrarianism is inextricably linked with distributism because, as Father McNabb would like to say, we have to put first things first. And the most fundamental concern of economy is, what will I eat tomorrow? How am I going to put something in my belly? If you have something stored in your larder and you're going to eat it tomorrow, that's a form of capital. It's the most basic form, in a way, of capital, because you're going to use that bread in your pantry for energy tomorrow. And so we have to have much, much greater respect in our laws and in our cultures for the people that produce our food. We have to really revere and honor our farmers, especially the small farmers. We have to help protect them through lobbying efforts and other things, from major things like Cargill and Monsanto from coming in and taking them over and making them just part of some faithless global corporation.
Absolutely wonderful. I don't have anything to add to that. You really covered it, but I would give also some practical examples on what my family does locally here in South Carolina, going back to the principle of every dollar that you spend is a vote for a distributive society if you spend it properly. We buy most of our meat from the local Carolina Growers Group, which is a cooperative of local small farmers who lease a shop in the local small town, and we go and buy our meat from them and other things from them. We go to the local Happy Cow Creamery for our dairy products. I buy raw milk and drink raw milk, which is not requires no industrial processing. So we can, and if we go and eat out, we go to the locally owned restaurants, not to the chains. So, living in the middle of it, I don't live in a city, but I live, I live where all these things are. We can still help to bring about the sort of society we want by the sort of lifestyle that we live.
So we have still one free marketer left here on our comments. So he asked, what is inherently wrong with the free market that is looking at an individual with the possibility and right of private property and unhired trade? So what is wrong in the metaphysics, he asked, of a free market? What would you say? Where would you put the finger?
Well, I would go back to what Joseph said earlier, that I think the free market, to a certain extent, is a myth, that there's this force that operates mysteriously, what Adam Smith would refer to as the hidden hand, that's just going to operate according to set laws. What really we have with economics is a predictive science that tries to analyze human behavior and then make reliable predictions based on it. And that's more or less successful depending on the economist. Your mileage will vary, but there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea of letting a market function work, letting price functions, supply and demand. That's fine. The idea of a free market, to go to that metaphysics aspect of the question, is that it evades important questions of ethics, morality, and teleology that I talked about in my presentation. The why, what are things for? There's a lot of things that could be bought and sold, which if you had an utterly free market, free of any kind of regulation, you could sell human persons. That's been done in the past. It's actually done now. There are more slaves on planet Earth right now than at any other time in human history. And that's at the same time that arguably the free market is as widespread on planet Earth as ever in human history. I'm not saying that capitalism and slavery go hand in hand, although slavery arguably is one of those legal structures the government sets up to sort of help the bottom from falling out from the things that capitalism can't predict. It stabilizes the workforce, certainly. So, but slavery is a commodity that should not be traded, right? Human beings are not a commodity. And so there have to be some kinds of limitations on what we would call the free market. The question are, what are those limitations going to be? And what are the resources that we're going to use in determining that question? Are we going to draw on reliable philosophy and religion and morality, or are we going to look at numerical charts and data and simply look at the bottom line and what the cheapest way is? Distributists answer in the former way. We're going to look at the theology and decide how to regulate our market that way.
Yeah, again, wonderful, Joe. The only thing I would add to that is, and I've heard this, but the first thing I would say is that the person is someone who believes in the free market, and yet the definition he gave about private property, etc., is not necessarily conducive to a free market. In other words, at what point, first of all, the free market doesn't exist. I don't know how many times I need to say this. It is the same sort of thing as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that we would all be nice to each other if there were no rules. But that's built upon a false anthropology, right? That we are inherently selfish, and if there are no rules, the most ruthless will win. And what's true of human society is true of the human market, all right? That basically whoever has power in the market manipulates that market for their own good. Now, so there has to be some sort of regulation of the market to ensure that other people can enjoy the market. We can actually go there and have things to sell and have the money to buy things. Otherwise, we're excluded from the market. And it might be a free market according to those with lots of power to manipulate the market. But for those of us that are excluded from the market or just kept on the margins of the market by that process, it's not a free market at all.
Yes. Also, one of the questions, I will modulate it a little bit, asks if distributism is like only wishful thinking, because as Hilaire Belloc said, you cannot force distributism upon people. It can only be made by the people. But like 100 years have passed since the idea, and still we don't see it like anywhere, like in power, that some country we can say is distributist country. So what can we do to get it started?
Joe, can I jump in first here? Break my own rules. I'll let you come in afterwards. Sure. I would argue actually that the coronavirus shows that far from distributism being wishful thinking, globalism is wishful thinking. That basically we're building our economic and political model on an unsustainable basis. That globalism is putting all of our eggs in one basket. It's going to be one disaster after another, with all of us subject to the domino effect of globalism. That basically what we need in an economy and in a politics and in the human family is sustainability. What distributism offers is a sustainable alternative to the unsustainable present day globalism. And as for it being practical, I don't know how many times we've given lots of examples here, you know, of how you in your own life can help bring about a more distributist society, so that when you die, it's more distributist than you were when you were born. That's all. That's what we're supposed to do as Christians, right? Is that we live a life of virtue, so that when we die, you know, the world, at least the world that we touched, right? We don't rule the world, thanks be to God, right? That all the world that we touched, all the people that we touched, the world is a better place because of the sanctity which we gained by the grace of God, by our cooperation with it. I would argue that distributism is merely acting virtuously in the field of the economy. So we are called to do it every single day of our lives, every time we spend $1. Joe, sorry.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that that, you know, Chesterton famously critiqued H.G. Wells both in Heretics and in Orthodoxy for espousing the myth of progress for its own sake. And he said the progress spoken of separate from anything else is nonsense. It doesn't actually say anything, because you have to ask the question of what are you progressing toward? If you don't have a goal in mind, you're not progressing towards anything. And I would say that yes, distributism is idealistic, because any consideration of the future is based upon ideals. You're planning for something that hasn't happened yet. The future is not a real thing. We can't be, in that sense, realists about the future, because it doesn't exist yet. We're creating it through our decisions and our actions, and that's based on and grows out of our ideals. We're not simply mechanical cogs operating by base instinct or like atoms whirring around based on laws that are written into the universe. Not in that way. God has given us free will. So, you know, a strict materialistic market analysis can't really aim us towards the future. It can't set the goalposts that we're moving towards. And communism errs on the other side, because communism creates a utopia, an insane future that nobody should even want to progress towards. But even if we tried, we could never get there. We could never get to the workers of the world uniting, throwing over the bourgeoisie, and using the government to do so, establishing it as a totalitarian state, and then everyone will eventually live in peace and harmony, and the state will dissolve away. That was Marx's idea. That's absurd. So we don't err on the side of cockeyed optimism like the Marxists, but we also don't descend into kind of a Darwinian cynicism like the capitalists. Distributists are idealists, but that's because ideals are a good thing to have.
Yeah, one thing I would say, just to add to that very quickly, is that what the perfect human being is Jesus Christ. And we are called to be perfect as our Lord is perfect. Will we ever achieve that? No, we won't. But the more that we try to achieve it, the better we will be, and the better everybody else will be, because we are like that. So again, Jesus Christ is the ideal. We can't reach that ideal, but in aspiring towards that ideal, we make ourselves and others better.
Good. And one short question. I suppose you watched the film It's a Wonderful Life? Yes. Question is, could the clients of George Bailey be described as an urban distributist?
Sure. I think that actually the savings and loan model, which is active here in the United States as what's called credit unions, is certainly another workable way of modeling distributism, because we understand that when we deposit money in a bank, it goes off and does other things. And credit unions, unlike the major banks, avoid huge rates of usury in terms of how they collect interest on loans that go out. And they tend to be much more generous with loans that they provide. And I think that that's depicted in that film. I'll also mention about that film, and since we're on the topic of economics, there's online, you can search for this, but I think it was McSweeney's magazine, but Ayn Rand, it was a satire of Ayn Rand writing a movie review of It's a Wonderful Life. And she did not like it in the fictional imagining of her watching that movie. Although I think I might have heard somewhere that she actually did know of and did not like it. So, but yeah, you should look that up if you have a chance.
The other really funny thing was, Joe, and sort of on the topic, is there was a free market libertarian who wrote a critique of Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, and actually attacked Ebenezer Scrooge for basically violating the free market. And he would have been much better off if he just carried on practicing his usury rather than giving his money away willy-nilly.
Great. And maybe last question, which books would you recommend to someone who wants to go more into the topic? We mentioned Joseph Pearce, Small is Still Beautiful, but maybe some other books from Chesterton, Belloc, or some modern distributists.
Sure. The Hound of Distributism, which is a collection of essays put out by the American Chesterton Society of Gilbert Keitha Chesterton, but it's ACS Books. They produce a book of essays called The Hound of Distributism, which I would recommend as a good entree into the subject. And if you're looking to read sort of the masterworks or the pillars of the movement, certainly read the papal encyclicals on economics, Rerum Novarum and its anniversaries, Quadragesimo Anno, Septuagesimo Anno, Centesimus Anno. But you should also probably look to Belloc. His essay on the restoration of property from 1936, I think, is probably one of the most important works in the canon. And in terms of Chesterton, it's all over the place, but the one that stirs me the most is What's Wrong with the World. There's something in the rhetoric of that book that I find really charming and stirring, and it makes you want distributism. It makes you want distributism. It inspires that idealism in us, and I think that that's a good thing that book does. It's very rousing.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I agree with all of those titles. Belloc's other book, The Servile State, is worth reading because that gives, if you like, the history of how distributism, the original distributism of the past, was basically destroyed by the process of industrialization. So that's sort of a history, an economic history book, but very, very good as an overview. I would also, as regards Chesterton, I know the first distributist book by Chesterton I read was his collection of essays, The Outline of Sanity. So that's another one worth checking out. And as we've been discussing the free market, there is a very good book called Towards a Truly Free Market. Is John C. Mackay, is it? The author?
Yes.
Yeah. I can't remember the publisher, but Towards a Truly Free Market by John C. Mackay, if you really want to go deep into that particular aspect of the issue.
So thank you so much, Joseph and Joe, for your talks and for your answering our questions. We should have seen each other 2 times this year, but it seems it will have to wait for next year, but next year will then be much better than this year. So thank you so much. And I'm sure that you made many distributists in Croatia today. So that's a great accomplishment. I congratulate you for this.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a true joy and pleasure. God bless you, everybody. Bye-bye.
God bless you. Bye.
Thank you both. Thanks.
I will say just to say a few more words in Croatian to our friends. Evo, hvala svima koji ste pratili ovo, mislim, stvarno vrlo kvalitetno predavanje, odnosno 2 predavanja i odgovore na sva pitanja. Prvo ću vas sve podsjetiti da je naš 3. dio Chester Shock konferencije, online konferencije, će biti sa jednim mladim Francuzom koji se zove Camille Dalmas, vjerojatno nisam točno izgovorio, a on će govoriti o temi izrasti malen, ekologija trave. Evo, i mene samog zapravo zanima o čemu će to točno biti. Predavanje će biti u ponedjeljak, isto u 7 navečer, znači u isto vrijeme kad su bila i prva 2 predavanja. Također, podsjetio bih sve, to jest pozvao bih da obratite pozornost da u opisu videa imamo dole 2 linka. Jedan link je na distributistički manifest koji smo preveli na hrvatski jezik i to možete pročitati na našoj stranici Gilbert.hr, a drugi link je link na naše proizvode koje su također na stranici Gilbert.hr koji možete kupiti putem, ako donirate neke novce za klub, onda dobivate zapravo kao poklon određene naše proizvode. Evo, posljednje što imamo, to sam već bio i pokazao, je naš badge, pa evo, ako želite prepoznati distributiste na ulici, Chestertonijance, vrlo jednostavan način nose ovaj badge ili nose jednu od ovih naših majica koje imamo. Evo, zahvaljujem vam se svima još jednom na pozornosti i do ponedjeljka. Čuvajte se, čitajte Chestertona i čitajte distributističke tekstove i svako dobro.